Alrighty. Hey, folks. Sorry about that. We experienced some technical difficulties for some reason. We were shut down by the program, the software we're using, but things should be okay now. We'll have a little breather, so we give people time to rejoin this link, folks who are watching, to give you a catch up, because we were talking for a bit and we didn't hear, we didn't know we were down. We're talking here about protest and the nature of protesting, and this new bill that we might have seen online. It's called the Police Crime Sentencing and Court Bill, and the idea is that police need more powers to crack down on protests, such that we don't get what we saw in the Extension Rebellion protest, but also Black Lives Matter last year. Where we paused was I was about to ask Hamish, who just said that sometimes violence is needed. And I was saying, well, it's interesting we say that, because when we say violence, it's a word, of course, but ultimately it's either violence towards somebody. So in the case, like I said, 21 people injured, or it's violence towards property. Are you saying that sometimes violence towards property, people's private property, and violence towards people like body is sometimes needed? Is that what you're saying?
I wouldn't say personally. I think the private property part, if it's someone's personal property, I think it's where I'm a bit like, no, I wouldn't say that. I would say more in terms of maybe government buildings. I would say in terms of if you actually want a message out, I would say government buildings personally. Rather than actual private. Yeah.
So when you say government, do you mean local? Do you mean local government?
Oh, God's sake. Right. Like, maybe, potentially. I would say maybe even going into like actual government buildings in terms of like
trespassing.
Maybe you have to, just to actually like be like, we demand change and stuff, and actually having to do something in that line. Sometimes you just have to, because look at history. In history, they have to do stuff illegally, right? For example, the suffragettes, for example, had to do something illegally, had to riot. The whole kind of Stonewall riot as well. They have to. Violence in that sense, yes, is needed in some occasions.
So quick one. Did you support the Donald Trump folks who assailed the Capitol and broke into the Speaker's house and broke into the?
That's different. That's completely different.
Why is it different? They were protesting an unfair system.
I wouldn't say so, because they were kind of
different because you don't agree with their protest.
No. Don't call it that. No, I wouldn't say so, because their message, for example, wasn't legitimate. For example, because they were trying to protest to something in terms of like, the election was stolen, when the election was evidently not stolen, right?
Well, that's what they believe. That's what they believe. Same way when you say that the country's systematically racist, some people go, "No, I don't see it that way. It's not systematically racist."
But if there's evidence behind it, surely that's fine to do. Surely, if you have the evidence behind this truth, then surely you are able to perform that truth, essentially.
Well, this is my fear, though, and this is why I bring the point up is, of course, we all know as commentators that some issues are so tumultuous that the facts, people go, "Oh, facts, don't care about your feelings." Facts are readily and easily manipulated to fit a narrative and to make a point. We know that. My surprise is that you think it's okay to cross the illegal kind of part, because that just opens up a can of worms, surely, because there's always two sides of and
it's just tricky. It's tricky because it's like, I understand, like there's just certain times where, like, yes, you can be nice and sometimes you can be peaceful in terms of your messages, but it comes to a point where like you might have to really just actually have to damage stuff to make your voice heard. Like Black Lives Matter, for example, right? They're just frustrated the fact that another Black American has died in the hands of the police, and they've been seeing this constantly, right? I don't want to speak for everyone else's experiences, but they are probably pissed off, and so they have to be like, what, screw this. We're living a system that is not changing. We might as well try and change the system for ourselves. That's when it gets to a point where violence might have to be needed. Of course, there's times where, like, yes, violence is tricky to use and stuff. I know it's just tricky. I find that's when it's like, when you actually want to change the system and it's not changing, then sometimes violence is the only answer to that change. And sometimes I don't sometimes agree with that, but sometimes that is what it is. That's how I feel. Yeah.
I'll take your point. Go on, Messiah.
No, I just wanted to say that we have to remember not be. One thing I want to start with is the idea of preference in how people protest or resist whatever they don't like. Some people just have a preference which is non-violent. And some people are less likely to be violent based on, again, their preferences or what they have access to or their communities or what they've been socialized to think is right or wrong. So if your preference is not to be violent, that's okay. But then to project the narrative that someone else's preference is wrong, and this is not me again, this is me just making a distinction.
Of course it's wrong to be violent.
I know, but I'm saying your preference to how to enact something, if you think it's wrong, it's based on certain things that you believe is a better way to do things. Other people, they don't see it like that. And that's how life is. Some people will feel like actually the only way to get my voice across or the only way I feel to be heard or I want to express myself is through violence. And this is not me defending people who are violent in a protest, because at the end of the day, the protest is made up of more people who are not violent than those who are being violent, right? So again, that's just one thing. Number two, when it comes to people protesting, just whether it's peaceful or unpeaceful, it's naive to think that incident is the biggest issue that is upsetting them. It's one of many things that have probably created an environment that makes them want to resist something. So yes, we were upset in the UK that a man in America was murdered by a police officer, but that also triggered another set of feelings about actually it's systemically in society. How do some people feel that they're being treated? How many times have these people, because a lot of people on the ground are activists. A lot of people talk about this work from a site of like, oh, I'm on Twitter, I'm on YouTube, I'm just talking. But a lot of other people, actually, when you see people like Sisters Uncut who lead organizations, when we are not upset about things or we don't know about the police structure or what's happening to women, when we live our normal lives, they're on the ground. They're lobbying, they're communicating with key stakeholders, they're being very peaceful, but at the same time, they know what it has, what the potential of this sameness is going to have on other people. So when we look at it, are we assuming that this was the first point, their first option? Are we assuming that everybody is like, what are we assuming here? And I think at the end of the day, it's about preference. Some people genuinely will not be violent. If you're not a violent person or you don't feel like that's the way you need to express yourself because you've got other ways to do it, this will always seem very crazy to you. And that's okay.
Yeah, no, but
that's okay.
I totally take your point. I just think for the interest of like clarity, I want to ask some clarifying questions because there's some things you've said, especially you made 2 points. The first one, when you spoke about non-violence as a preference, I don't think the debate is whether it's a preference or not. It's whether it's right or wrong.
No, it's not about what is right or wrong. It can't be.
It has to be, because hold on, we have to agree that violence is wrong. Like, surely
violence violence itself is not wrong or right. It's about the propensity. How do you get to that stage? It's like saying if you have the idea in perpetuating violence, right? It seems like this.
I just at risk of kind of going too far, I want us to kind of stick to the protest kind of So go ahead.
So I'm saying in the idea of protest, right? Again, depending on your position in that conversation, what you've seen, how you're connected to that conversation, to you, violence might seem to you like the only weapon or the only tool you have to make your point. So to some people, that's why not everyone is violent, because a lot of people actually recognize the other tools that they have or prefer those other tools, and that's okay. But some people feel like
it's not okay, because that's the point.
Okay. I'm not saying the violence is okay. I'm saying if that is your preference, the concept that is what you resort to.
That's
okay. It is.
But it couldn't be, because hold on, this is literally why people break the law. It's because they believe like they would like to break the law. They believe it's the only thing they have.
That's what people are saying.
Hold on. Let me make the point, because I literally tried to listen to make sure I wrote down what you folks are saying. Because if we take what happened in Bristol as an example, I think we're conflating a lot of different things and we're making value judgments. But I'm just trying to be absolutely clear about this, which is 21 police officers have been injured. 2 people are seriously injured. 1 person is suffering broken bones. Another is suffering a punctured lung, right? Now, somebody might say, for me, and the way I think about protests, we go out there and we harm, and we throw stuff at the police, and we're violent towards them. They might say that's a preference. I'm saying, I understand that's your preference, but I would then say to them, you're wrong. And the law would agree with me, because they would be arrested and put into jail. Vice versa, if a police officer goes, I'm a police officer, And yes, my job is to keep people safe, but sometimes I just like to whack people on the head, as it were.
They go to prison.
Not that they're going to prison. My point is it wrong? I would say the same thing, wrong. If there's evidence of it, should they be tried? Yes. Should they? Now, the reality is things, police protect each other and all these other things. That's a separate discussion. The point I'm trying to have is something right or wrong? If we're saying that, violence is only a preference thing. If you're non-violent, that's just your preference. Other people prefer to be violent. It's like, no,
no one said there's no consequences to it. That's what I'm trying to say.
I'm saying it's wrong. I'm saying it's wrong. It's my point.
And that's how you feel. And we've heard you. We know that you think
the law
it's wrong.
also agrees with me.
And that's fine. But the law is made, which means it's made on someone's preference. That's not it. The law. Where did the law come from? The law came from an outcome of someone's preference.
It's in all our preferences not to have violence perpetuated against.
But if it's all of it, if it's all of us, then why are some people violent then? And even if it is all of us, it's never going to be all. It's always going to be a protected majority involved in that conversation. So if we're really realistic about how the law is created, this is not me agreeing with any side. Let's not look like to say the law is a reflection of what society wants, because we'll be very naive. Whether it's about protests or anything else, it's not necessarily a reflection of what society wants. So therefore, and even if you think it is, there's always going to be people that don't agree with that. So whether it's right or wrong, that is the argument that you're placing on the outcome of violence. Cool. When you deal with people who have, for example, some people who have very turbulent childhoods, right? When you look at psychiatrists and psychologists and therapists, they don't focus on, obviously they will say this person has tendency to be violent because of what they've gone through, which is we have to remove them from society or remove them from places where they can enact danger, because we know that the outcome of violence, we don't agree with that. That's not where you can run society. But the focus would not be on how to stop that person being violent by taking the weapon out of their hand, but how do we mitigate them getting to that stage? What are they acting out upon? What are the environments that they're creating? That's how we've always moved. So my thing about violent protests in my head is that, don't get me wrong, nobody here is, if it was violence about violence, they would have written on the flyer, come with your pots and pans and your guns and let's fight. That's not what we're saying. What we're trying to be realistic about on both sides is that, yes, if you are going to be violent, which we tell you not to be, right? This is the consequence, because this is the country you live in, whether you like it or not. This is the country you live in.
Let's take Aaron's point here, Busia. What do you think? Aaron says there's a small side of me that wants the government to fight back against these protesters. So suppose we had, people getting violent at a protest, right? Is it then okay in protection of themselves for the police to be very violent back as well?
Did you answer that question? Does it make sense to you? Why would then the police be violent to all protesters? Or what are you talking about?
No. I'm saying that if people are being violent at protests, right, they're getting aggressive. We saw, like I said, 21 police officers injured, right? Aaron's saying, well, are the police officers then allowed to equally go back and also punch, because you'll see sometimes with protests, when we see images of fighting and you see like police officers and people getting into it, people go, the police officer should never do that. The police officer should either take it, try and pin them down, and that's their job. But people can be as violent as they want. What Aaron seems to be saying here is, should the government be? And I say the government.
It wouldn't. No, because the government.
I also think it depends. In my eyes, I think it absolutely depends on the sense of like, well, why are the protesters acting in such a way? Surely you don't just randomly go to a protest, right, and be like, I'm just going to randomly go violent, right? I'm just going to randomly just.
Some people do.
No, but not all people.
Angry.
Not all
people are forgetting. We're living in a time where people are angry. This is not just, I think, again, if you isolate a situation between a police officer and an individual, you can come to very different conclusions. But actually, if we saw it, that police officer, we understand why, you've responded a particular way because that's a particular incident. When we talk about protests in a wider conversation, and we look at the context of which we're working in, there's a difference between a police officer who we believe is susceptible to be trained to protect the government, to protect society, to know how to de-escalate a crisis, versus a person who is expressing themselves to say, you know what, I'm really angry and tired, I'm going to throw things. No one said that's the right thing to do. That's why I said I didn't talk about it wrong or right. But at the same time, I do believe we have to make sure that we're not making the conversation very small to fit our agenda here. No, the conversation, this is a big bill. This is not a small thing. This is a big bill. But people are tired. People have different, and don't forget, it's different communities coming together to fight the bill for different reasons. This isn't a one-stop shop. If it was the case, we could if it was tuition fees, we could say, okay, you don't want tuition fees to happen. Okay, cool. Why would it result in violence? We can look at that in a certain lens and be like, what we're discussing here on a balance, it doesn't. There's an element of why would it escalate unless it gets to a certain time or a certain idleness. But when we talk about a policing bill, and the funny thing is, those at the center of the bill are the ones in, I guess you can even argue, in danger of having to now stop a protest. That in itself, the logic there means that there will be a point where order needs to be maintained and community relations need to be built, but in the absence of police. Are we prepared for that in society? Because the police sometimes will be at the topic of conversation. And this is why we're having these debates, because we're not being honest.
No, I hear you. I'm going to jump to Hamish, and then I'm going to ask you folks a question about riots, because that's the next extension. And Siobhan Bailey spoke about this. She's a Conservative MP, and I want to get some of your reactions to her thoughts. But Hamish, you were going to say something. You said that it depends, because you brought up this violence point, which is one of the things that the bill aims to curb, is the violence that takes place in protests, right? And when they become really quote unquote uncivil, of course, by nature, they are uncivil, but we'll talk about what it's trying to curb in a minute. But yeah, what are your thoughts? You said that it depends on this whole violence point.
I just feel like the thing is, this is the thing, maybe it's my own biases coming into it, potentially. Maybe it's why I support certain violence over other violence, potentially. Because maybe it is because of my sort of bias. And I also just feel like, I just don't feel that there's the right way or the wrong way to protest. Protest is protest, unfortunately. Like there's no this perfect book of like, here's how to protest, do this, do this, do that. I just find there's times where like it goes back to sort of the preference. Like some people do prefer, and I'm not saying like I agree or disagree with it. I just think some people like to be violent versus some people who don't like to be violent. There's just this preference of doing that. So I find that, there are times when violence has achieved certain things. I've go back to this, Stonewall and the suffragettes. I've always gone back to that because it shows that violence can work. And there are times where, yes, non-violence has worked as well. Look at Martin Luther King, for example, or, Gandhi, for example. Like there's loads of these protests that have gone non-violent and have worked. However, there are times where you get to a point of saying, we live in the system, nothing's changing. What gets to a point of saying, you know what, we might as well change something. We might as well go violent, because if the government's not listening, we might as well do something that's violent so that they make the government listen.
Well,
so it gets to that point.
I get your point, but some of the examples you give, it only works if you look at them in isolation. There's also another thing, which is, does change happen because of said protest or in spite of those protests? The notion change happens because of a plethora of different things. No one on this stream is going to say one protest led to change. That's not the truth. Protests happen change happens for a number of different things. But what I'm not sold on yet is whether certain protests we look at through history, furthered or actually set back certain movements. I think the jury's out on that. We can go back and forth on it, because I can quote to you protests as I was doing off air. We remember before the tuition fees were going to be raised, we saw a ridiculous amount of students out protesting. It even got a bit violent. Remember, people broke into, I don't know if it was the Conservative Party headquarters, but I remember some offices were smashed into and folks were really angry. And a few months later, the tuition fees went up. The largest demonstration we've seen in this UK for a long time, before the Iraq war, we saw people flooded London streets. And still, we were told about weapons of mass destruction, and we went anyways. So this notion that violence works or peaceable protest does works, I think the jury's out. Martin Luther King didn't just do non-violent protest in a vacuum. You had other civil rights leaders also doing all sorts of other things, and all of that together added to what we're talking about here. What I want to get into here is to ask you folks: are riots, just to contextualize this violence point, are riots necessary?
They're products. I think people are looking at riots like pre-planned. Right, I would like to know a riot that is pre-planned, that is organized, that says,
I can tell you one. The riots in the London riots. That was planned. That was planned on BBM. I received a number of messages.
It wasn't planned. It wasn't planned because we were all there. The riots.
People got messages beforehand. It's all over the news. People got messages beforehand.
Well, maybe in your area. For me, how I saw the riots,
because people got a lot of messages saying we're gonna be here, guys.
Yeah, but violent. 100%. But you're not talking about the moment before that. The moment before that, the riot happened right in Tottenham area, right, and it spread across, right. The riots are contagious. They tend to happen or like that. When people in inner city places or people that they resemble do things, it spreads. Young people were spreading them, yeah. But I would say it might have been coordinated, but organized. And the coordination is not even on a sense of like, okay, we really want to make that was young people being like, you know what, right, what's happening in your city? Can you get away with that? Boom, boom, boom. But it might, to me personally,
smashing local stores.
100%, 100%. But what I'm trying to say about riots, right, is that they are a product. If you look at them as things that are used as weapons or used as a way to get things done, we're looking at it all wrong. They are a byproduct of situations that get overly heated. And most of the time, the situation that happened overnight, which means people are doing fight or flight. Do you know what I'm saying? So when you look at those things, as I said, when you talk about violence, I'm not trying to say about being good or bad. That's a different conversation. But in terms of as a byproduct of, what is it a byproduct of? Because this is what we have to get understand. It's like saying you slap a child and they cry. Is crying going to stop you from receiving? No, it doesn't. But actually, you're not looking at why did I cry? Is crime right or wrong? You can get to the element of, oh, it's not going to stop you getting hurt. But yeah, that's how I'm going to express this after the fact that's happened. And it's the issue I have with the conversation. Sometimes it's about, yeah, okay, but why is our brains wired to look at, but why is that your method means? What does that say about you when you see people rioting? Where does your mind go to?
With all the reasons, because we're discussing the bill, and the bill purports to curtail these things. That's why we're talking about it. There's a separate conversation about how these things even begin and chronic, under investment.
It's not separate. This is why people are objecting.
I'll tell you why it's no. But here's the thing: is you have a government majority. We're talking about the bill being passed here. That's what the discussion is about. So when Siobhan Bailey defends the bill and says that actually, the bill recognizes protest and how fair they are. However, this idea that you can protest for weeks, you can block roads, you can stop trains, you can prevent people from earning a living or even seeing dying relatives in hospitals because of disruptive protest during the coronavirus period. Suddenly, you do have to answer yourself, do you think that's still a price worth paying for those protests right now and this bill?
Because at the end of the day, and as I say, the question you ask closes the conversation depending on what you want to be answered. I understand it. But for me, I'm saying that God forbid there's a situation that occurs that I cannot foresee that will require a protest to last for weeks, right? My head, it seems like it's disrupting. And again, how I'm living right now, there's very few things that I'd like to be disrupted because I'm really not, like my anger is just so normal and it's just more like, okay, but God forbid someone's brave enough, or if I'm not disabled and there's a disability crisis and they want to protest or people want to protest on their behalf and it has to take weeks because you know what, as people who live in London or the UK, the only thing we don't like is people wasting our time. And that is the biggest currency in sometimes in certain societies. So what you do is you use that time or property because of the value we have on it. You won't listen if you go through normal means. And this is not me saying that I won't be affected. If I want to go on holiday now and Extinction Rebellion is on the train on the track, I'll be upset. But is my upset more? I have to think of a second, actually, if it was Black Lives Matter, or if it was an incident that affected me or someone I've related to, sometimes these things take weeks. Who are we now to say, you have to be very cautious and be like, why are they so keen to have something like a 24-hour protest? What gets done in 24 hours that they're okay with protest lasting a short amount of time or not being disruptive?
To be honest, I don't think a protest going for 3 days.
No, but you know what I'm saying? In terms of disrupting, the idea is that we want to disrupt you, but now the bill is saying you can protest without it causing disruption. Okay.
Well, this is the thing. Causes disruption as well.
No, hold on. I think again we're saying lots of different things that are getting mixed up. I don't think, and I think we all might have different beliefs on what the point of protesting is. Some say and protest, and a synonym folks will often use is that it's a demonstration, and so their thing is the protest is meant to demonstrate. Now the byproduct is disruption, but because the focal point is demonstration, once the demonstration's done, we move away, and therefore the disruption is minimal. Whereas there are other people who think, no, the point of the protest is actually disruption, which means we're going to sit on the train track for weeks. And that way, no one can get to their job. And in this case, we're going to block certain roads so that people can't go see dying relatives from COVID, right? That's a different thing. I think that's a different type of protest.
No, but it goes back to what we were saying before, Michael.
Hold on. Just because just to make the point, the point of one is to demonstrate. The point of the other one is to disrupt. And so what some may say this bill purports to solve, right, or to curtail, is protests that are typically or a priori, about disruption. And those kind of protests where the volume's super high, quote unquote, and it's getting rowdy and stuff like that. That's what, if Priti Patel was saying here, that's what she's saying, that we need to curtail those type of protests, because no one's interested in disruption.
And that's how and this is why I said before, when I said about preference, you've kind of said the same thing about if the interpretation of things is different. It's based on the fact that people fundamentally believe different things, right? So that's why it's always going to be a bit testy, because it's like how you interpret, how you see it is different, cool. But also, again, we have to think about actually what types of protest is ideal for a government that doesn't want to be lobbied against or protested against. You have to make it make sense. Why would, and don't get me wrong, there will be times, and I could probably imagine it, where it's like, come on, because it's not an issue close to my heart, I might be like, you know what, can you pack this up, or at least block the other road? I hear that. But at the same time, I'm looking at it like, what if it's about racism and people dying at the hands of police, not just racism, dying at the hands of police, or sexual assault, or mental health crisis, or the climate change? These people are not stepping outside their house because it's something that they can come home on Tuesday after going out or being out on Monday. These are things that by default of demonstrated, I need to disrupt, because the contribution you're making to the world, or contribution you're making to the CO2 emissions, is what I'm demonstrating. So me stopping you is also showing some sort of solidarity. So what my point is that let's not undermine the types of issues people are protesting. Again, it might be based on our experience of those issues that we say, you know what, there's a better way, but it might be better for you because I might be university educated, so therefore I can do policies, I will sign petitions. But what if George Floyd was my father or my cousin or something? Would I really be like, you know what, guys, let's wait until the verdict happens? Or also, if there's other outcomes that have happened where, they don't listen, then what do you do? And that's what I'm saying. You have to look at it in terms of, why are our hearts and minds always drawn to the violent part of it, and go, these people are bad, rather than saying, okay, if we know that all protests have set to be being bad, it's not a new debate then. It's not new. Technically, we're not dealing with anything new, right? It's just, okay, cool, last year the statues were done, and I don't think we'll get to that point. Then do something about statues and we can know that it's isolated to that issue. But now hanging everything into it, I'm like, actually, if I was a government, why would I empower people to protest against me? I don't understand it. So on that level, surely we could all be like, okay, whether or not we know it's an ulterior motive or not, the government will not make it easy for you to protest against them. And as people, we need to make sure we remember that. And not go, it's right because it's in the law, all right? But look how they want to change the law with the protest bill. At the same time, we're saying it's against the law. But aren't they making laws as we go? Aren't we making laws now? Isn't this what the bill's supposed to turn into?
And one thing that will obviously happen, and what someone could say as a rebuttal to that is, the next government, right, if they think this power's gone too far, can revoke it. And we'll see if the Labour Party, who folks herald as people who are pro-protests, would suddenly say, you know what, let's do it, and we'll see what happens there. Hamish, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I also just feel like, it would be very convenient if people didn't have to protest in the first place. Why would we actually get politicians to solve these issues in the first place? Like, the fact is, Extinction Rebellion exists because of the fact that, the government hasn't solved this climate change crisis right now. Extinction Rebellion didn't have to, block Rupert Murdoch newspapers if the government was, doing its targets in terms of climate change. So you have to also think, like, the politicians themselves should look at themselves and think, there are certain issues out there that needs to be solved. Yet, people are out here protesting because they want the politicians to solve these issues right now. So it's very convenient. It would be very convenient if people didn't have to protest in the first place. But these politicians are too lazy to give, a toss about these issues. And I think it's more inconvenient for them to not solve these issues rather than, protesting. Because at least we're trying, at least protesters are trying to at least solve these issues.
Well, again, I totally take your point. The thing to bear in mind, though, is I think it's also kind of a one-sided way to look at it, to say that folks protest. So take the climate change, for instance. Not everyone agrees with Extinction Rebellion. They don't summarize the views of all British people. They're a specific group who have a specific agenda, and so the question is, if you have a specific group with a specific agenda, how should that group lobby for change? Should they lobby for change at the expense of everybody else, right? Or should they seek all the different channels we have to get change across? Now, you may say those channels are fraught and there's a need for protest because it cuts through the noise, it makes the governments pay attention. But the notion that the way to get your point across, right, if you're a specific advocacy group, in the case of Extinction Rebellion, I know people in the UK who, right or wrong, don't really care about the climate as much as folks in Extinction Rebellion, right? Exactly. Now, that's a right or a wrong thing. But then that's why someone would advocate for this bill, because they say, well, yeah, go advocate for what you believe in, but I want to go see my parents, right? And I don't want you guys blocking the road for a week. I don't want that to be the case. Now, we can go back and forth whether that's right or wrong. That's the whole point of this conversation. But I think those are all the views, so that all the views are reflected. The notion that it's the government being lazy and passionate, real right people protesting, and the government just needs to act. And I just don't think those are the only views that should be represented. I'm not saying that's what you're saying. I'm just saying that's the other view. There might be someone watching who's thinking, well, actually, I don't believe in these groups. Like that's not my perspective. And so
yeah,
I'm giving voice, if you like, to what they might say. Let's consider some of these comments we're seeing. Someone said they are seeking those channels as well as protested mic. They have policy suggestions. They have lobby governments as well as using their fundamental rights to protest. I presume that Jack is speaking about Extinction Rebellion. Let's see if we can take some more comments here. We've got Aaron who says no problem with peaceful protest. It's interesting because Martin Luther King Jr. once said that a riot is the language of the unheard. Speaking to your point there, Busayo, that it's kind of it's a product. A riot's a product. It's never anyone's preferred way to make their voice heard. And from a quick scan, those are the points I got. We run out of time, so I want to get some closing remarks from some of you folks. You know, what are some of your thoughts? And I want you to answer one question in particular, which is, you're right. You know, the government's got to do more. Things need to change. The government needs to take some of these these issues more seriously. Now, it's almost a case that this bill will go through because the Conservatives have a thumping majority, and there's the political will and desire to get it done. So suppose we can't kill the bill. What do we do about protest moving forward? What would your advice to people be? And we'll start with you, Hamish, and then. Sorry.
Okay, fine. No, it's good. No. I can go. I would still protest. I'll still protest, even though, even if there's these laws in place, I would still protest as much as I can, as much. Keep on, yeah, exactly what Jack's saying. Thank you, Jack. Keep on protesting as much as you can, really, in the most way possible, really, in that sense. So I find, even though this bill is here, I think protesting is still needed in this country, especially with its main issues. I find, even if it goes violent as well. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
A fair point. Well, thank you very much for that, Hamish. I'm gonna bring on, of course, or go back, if you like, to Busayo. Fascinating discussion, I think. Lots of interesting perspectives. What are your thoughts?
I just pray that one day we're not in a position where protesting is the only source that we have, and then we'll look back at a conversation like this and say, we hope not, because I guess there's many different things we could talk about internationally, and I think sometimes we give them more empathy, like NSAR's movement that ends up being violent in some regard, and we wouldn't really say it shouldn't be. You have to think about what is happening in that moment in time between those two people or those two institutions that requires that escalated that. And again, it's not necessarily because the protesters, there's never an argument that it's self-defense, It's always an assumption that everyone's protesting. It's like, oh yeah, I looked at the police and I threw a rock. There's a lot of accounts where if you're really into the protesting movement, that you've seen that people are being, there's agitation and unnecessarily police presence there, which turns it into an environment of animosity, actually. But ultimately, if it does pass, there's two things. People don't always have the privilege of just saying go protest, because some people are going to be more police than others. So realistically, I know for certain Black communities or maybe working class communities, it's about really understanding what the rights are within the legal framework. So you know your rights, and you know how to avoid, and you know how to also look after younger or less disciplined members of that movement to say, listen, this is the confines of which we're going to protest. But also making sure you do protest and show up, because at the end of the day, as we know, bills are created, but they can also be changed. Something can be overridden, and it's only in hindsight that we will see that actually maybe this bill wasn't necessary. And it's because we're privy to the bill being passed that we have so much opinions on it. But there's a lot of things we don't question because it's just how we've grown up. So it's like, less. So I understand the conversation, and it's a thin line. But I always say the best course of action to make sure both sides don't feel hard done by is to how do we prevent it from getting to a point where a lot of what people are protesting against isn't things that are new conversations. Climate change didn't come about yesterday. So we could have actually de-escalated or had a conversation or had something done where those people feel engaged in a conversation. Black Lives Matter, that didn't need to happen. You know, people are lobbying against, you know, inequality. You know, the Queen, she's doing a diversity czar. She knows violence ain't the answer. You know what I mean? But on a serious note, there's many things going on, and we have to question actually their tools. You know?
Yeah. No, totally hear you, and thank you for your thoughts, and obviously thanks to Hamish as well. Lots of interesting perspectives. Like I said, it's no doubt this bill will go through. I really don't see anything that would stop it. And so it's something that we'll have to live with. Maybe it's for a little while until we have another government or there's a rethinking around this bill. But it's interesting because you're right. You know, the ability to freely gather is sacrosanct. It's really important in a liberal democracy. It's one of the ways that allows our democracy to be thriving, as we often call it. But there's no doubt that with COVID-19, emotions are high. I've read all sorts of articles over the past week about what protesting has led to, like the unintended consequences, if you like. And so I think that may have people feeling and thinking other things. But there's a diversity of perspectives around this, and we welcome them all, and that's why we enjoy doing this show, to give you guys or to give you folks listening a chance to hear all the different perspectives and make up your own mind, so to speak. So we come to the end of the stream. Before you go, I want to invite you to subscribe and turn your notification bell on. That way, when we're live next week, you'll get a straight message. And if you want to be a part of Common Sense, you want to join the community, you can do so at join.tcsnetwork.co.uk. And there you'll get emails, you'll get first access to lots of events and exciting things we have coming up in the future. This was an enjoyable debate, but during the week, we've got all sorts of different videos breaking down news, breaking down politics, people commentating and all sorts of different things. So get involved there too. And this will be available on rebroadcast, so you can just share the stream with a friend and keep talking about this is the point. So thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Thank you all. Thanks, Masai.